Hello, everyone. Greetings. This is Jim Ransom with another episode of Morning Jim. And welcome back to our program. We try to read exciting poems. Sometimes we don't fully succeed. And always strive to find interesting poems that are comprehensible and don't necessarily require an English major to get the point. I was once an English major, and I still have trouble getting the point, which I have made clear in an earlier program on some academic poems nowadays that are basically designed to be incomprehensible, in my view. Today, we may be pushing the envelope a little because I want to present some poetry and other information about Dylan Thomas, the Welsh poet whose career was forged in Wales, but actually a great deal of it took place in Britain, where he was broadcasting for the BBC during World War II, and then later in America. He is a poet who can engage us with a fervent emotionalism and create a rush of music in our brains, which we have to sort out. His most famous poem, as many of you already know, is an elegiac poem called "Do Not Go Gentle into That Good Night. Old men should rage and burn at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light." I read it at the funeral of my father many years ago, and at least at one time or another it was said to be read at 2 out of 3 funerals in America. I don't know about Wales. His name, Dylan, means son of the sea in Welsh, and he certainly lived up to it, I would say. I'd like to read a little bit about him, but before I do that, I'm going to read a short poem of his that I'm sorry about the paper shuffling. It just is something that happens. I want to read you a little bit from another one of his most famous poems, which is Fern Hill. It was written in 1945, probably when he was at the height of his powers right after World War II, where he had been broadcasting stories and poems on the BBC, oftentimes while the Blitz was crashing down. And it might be said to be a typical poem, Fern Hill, of his mature style. And so here it is. Now, as I was young and easy under the apple boughs, about the lilting house, and happy as the grass was green, the night above the dingle starry, time let me hail and climb golden in the heydays of his eyes, and honored among the wagons. I was prince of the apple towns, and once below a time I lordly had the trees and leaves trail with daisies and barley down the rivers of the windfall light. Well, that's quite an opening to a poem, and it's a beautiful poem. I'd like to read it all, but I want to move on to another poem of his that I like a lot. And before I get into it, I'm going to read you a little bit of the introduction to this book from which I'm reading. It's called Dylan Thomas Collected Poems, with an introduction by Paul Muldoon. And Paul Muldoon has written a kind of interesting introduction here. He says of Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night, we respond to the sense in that poem, and as in so many others, that the verse engine of the poem is so turbocharged and the fuel of such high octane that there's a distinct likelihood of the equivalent of a vertical liftoff. Dylan Thomas's poems allow us to believe that we may be transported, and that belief is itself transporting. And then he goes on to say that one of the main obstacles to readers immediately reaching the speed of sound is Dylan Thomas's own tabloidian history. I'm not going to go into much of that, since I don't want you to be slowed down by some of his lifestyle behaviors. So what we're going to be reading is a poem called Especially When the October Wind. Now, I might add that many, if not most, of Thomas's poems have the first line as also the title of the poem. There's a few like Fern Hill that don't follow that, but Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night is such a poem. And one of the things that's going to happen here in this reading is we're going to read it again after I finished it one time. I'm doing that with a little bit of doubt in my mind as to whether I should do that, but I think this poem might need a little explication. And after reading it over once, maybe I can make it a little more clear by going through it again with you. Not necessarily word by word, but at least in each separate stanza of the 4 stanzas that make up this poem. This poem demonstrates a technique that our friend Dylan Thomas used, and it's called Delayment. And I'll explain that when we get time for that part of the presentation. Especially when the October wind with frosty fingers punishes my hair, caught by the crabbing sun, I walk on fire and cast a shadow crab upon the land by the sea's side, hearing the noise of birds, hearing the raven cough in winter sticks. My busy heart, who shudders as she talks, sheds the syllabic blood and drains her words. Shut to in a tower of words, I mark on the horizon, walking like the trees, the wordy shapes of women and the rows of the star-gestured children in the park. So let me make you of the voweled beeches, some of the oaken voices from the roots of many a thorny shire tell you notes. Some let me make you of the water's speeches. Behind a pot of ferns, the wagging clock tells me the hour's word, the neural meaning flies on the shafted disk, declaims the morning and tells the windy weather in the cock. Some let me make you of the meadow's signs, the signal grass that tells me all I know, breaks with the wormy winter through the eye. Some let me tell you of the raven's aims. Especially when the October wind some let me make you of the autumnal spells, the spider-tongued and the loud hill of Wales, with fist of turnips punishes the land. Some let me make you of the heartless words. The heart is drained that, spelling in the scurry of chemic blood, warned of the coming fury, by the sea's side, hear the dark voweled birds. That is, in my view, a very beautiful poem. But what the heck does some of it mean? I guess it's fairly easy to tell the first two lines what they mean. He says, especially when the October wind with frosty fingers punishes my hair. We can tell it's windy on the beach and maybe a little cool in October. Caught by the crabbing sun, I walk on fire and cast a shadow crab upon the land. Well, the sun is already rather flat, like a Colorado skiing sun. In October, on the beach of Wales, and his shadow is a shadow crab upon the land. By the sea's side, hearing the noise of birds, hearing the raven cough in winter sticks, my busy heart, who shudders as she talks, sheds the syllabic blood and drains her words. Shut to in a tower of words, I mark on the horizon, walking like the trees, the wordy shapes of women and the rows of the star-gestured children in the park. The wordy shapes of women, what does that mean? Well, it's, I think, fairly simple there, and that is that when women are together, they walk and talk at the same time. Something that President Gerald Ford was said not to be able to accomplish. But women do speak 15 times as many words in the average day as men do. And that's probably genetic. I'm not going to lecture on that, on human development today, but we all know that, don't we? The star-gestured children in the park, well, they're waving at each other and making gestures. So that's not too hard. Now we come to the phenomenon of delayment, as it has been called. Some let me make you of the voweled beaches. I love that wording. And what he's doing there is he's leaving the main theme of the poem and taking you to the voweled beaches. Now, he's not saying beaches as in B-E-A-C-H-E-S, even though he's told us he's on or near a beach. He's talking about beech trees. Some let me make you of the voweled beaches. But he also wants us to hear the word beach in the other meaning as well. Some of the oaken voices from the roots of many a thorny shire tell you notes. Some let me make you of the water's speeches. So the wind going through the beech trees is sending sounds and voices just like it is from the waves on the shore. Behind a pot of ferns, the wagging clock tells me the hour's word. The neural meaning flies on the shafted disc, declaims the morning and tells the windy weather in the cock. Now, what the heck does that mean? Well, I think it's actually pretty understandable about if you think of it this way. The wagging clock means a mechanical clock with the hands that jump from minute to minute. instead of going steadily like the electronic clocks we use today. And it tells him the neural meaning flies on the shafted disc. Well, think about that. The neural meaning means you look at the clock and you can see where the hands are and you know the time because your brain is computing the time. The neural meaning flies on the shafted disc. Well, the clock has a disc where the hands are and a shaft from the mechanism of the clock fastens to the hands, and the neural meaning, of course, occurs very rapidly, so it flies on the shafted disc, declaims the morning, and tells the windy weather in the cock. It's a mechanical clock, and it has a rooster on it that's telling how much wind we're having that day. And then he delays us again with this line that we're familiar with. Some let me make you of the meadow's signs, the signal grass that tells me all I know. Signal grass grows on some beaches, at least back from the beach a ways, and it's a very fine grass that blows and lays over in the wind so that you can tell where the weather's coming from. And so that's what he means by the meadow's signs. The signal grass that tells me all I know breaks with a wormy winter through the eye. What he means by that, I think, is winter's coming. Winter's coming. The eye can tell us that it's getting time for winter because the wind is in the north and it's at that angle. And then he says, some let me tell you of the raven's sins. I want you to remember that because we're going to come back to that later. Especially when the October wind, some let me make you of autumnal spells, the spider-tongued and the loud hill of Wales, with fist of turnips, punishes the land. Now, the delayment in that set is, and it's in parentheses. Ordinarily it would read, especially when the October's wind with fist of turnips punishes the land. There are a lot of turnips growing in Wales and in Scotland and in Ireland. And before they dig them, winter comes on and the tops of the turnips are blowing in the wind and beating against the soil. And that's the fist of turnips punishing the land. But you see, before we get to that connection with the October wind, we get this little bit here in parentheses. Some let me make you of autumnal spells, the spider-tongued in the loud hill of Wales. He's distracting us there. And that's delayment. And then he goes on to say, some let me make you of the heartless words. The heart is drained that, spelling in the scurry of chemic blood, warned of the coming fury. What does that mean? Well, I don't want to make this too complex, but World War II began in September 1939, when the Nazis invaded Poland, and the British were automatically drawn into that war by treaty. And so they sent troops to Europe, but the French folded very quickly, so quickly that one of their generals, de Gaulle, took a large number of French troops that sailed across the Mediterranean to the French colonies in North Africa, like Tunisia, and set up the Free French government. But the British troops were pretty much trapped, and they escaped from the beaches of Normandy with a large flotilla of pleasure craft and other makeshift boats that came across the channel and took the great majority of the British troops away from Dunkirk and other places in where they would otherwise have been trapped. So the coming fury is what he remembers the most of his life in London, and that is the Blitz, when the Germans set almost nightly flights of bombers over the Channel and bombed the hell out of London, hoping that the British would give up. But by that time, Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister, and he rallied the Brits like no one else could do. And that's about the time, too, that Dylan Thomas came on board with the BBC and started his broadcasts. So we hear this: the heart is drained, that spelling in the scurry of chemic blood, warned of the coming fury. By the sea's side, hear the dark of voweled birds. And he's referring to the ravens, but also to the loud engines of the dark Nazi bombers coming across in the nighttime and bombing London. They tried it in the day as well, but the RAF, with its new accompaniment of wonderful Spitfire fighters, shot down so many of the Nazi bombers that the Nazis had to go to a nighttime bombing practice. Anyway, there's more to that poem, as I hope you can see, than just the words. And what he has done by repeating this line, "Some let me make you of the voweled beaches, and some let me make you of the water speeches," he's slowing down the otherwise fairly ordinary progression of the poem. Now, I think one poem by Dylan Thomas will have to do this morning because our time is short, and I want to read you a coda to that poem that brings in a little more information about Dylan Thomas. It's one that I wrote a few years ago, and it's kind of a coda to the "Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night" poem, and its title is "Go Gentle or Not." Part 1. He lived the way his dice landed in Welsh sand. Now, creeping along the dark streets of London, a sign proclaimed, "Keep calm and carry on, not the Welsh way to fight a war." When bombs came screaming out of night, the poet radioed his fluid words, calming the English and the Welsh, but the poet wasn't calmed. So after war, surprised survivor, now lauded, fed, and paid, toured America, no bombed out hulks, but himself. tables full of food, bars full of booze. He walked down aisles of women full of smiles and told them all the wonders of the Welsh. Part 2. Dylan wrote and womanized, wrote and drank. One night, the 18th whiskey killed him. He had forever fled from a childless land, from Caitlin, from the slopes of Fern Hill, held green and dying in his chains by the sea. Again the dice throw. Now I wend through the wars and webs, mighty under the stars and stripes, my time. But when I'm done, don't say I battled. Say I went gentle into that good night, while somewhere in the city a baby freshly born cries out, uncoddled by the womb, "Be quick now and throw the dice again." Lady Fate will lead him on his way. Okay, that's a touch of Dylan Thomas. I hope you'll get his collected poems and read them with a little bit more ease in interpreting what he's getting at. But he's a great poet and worth your time. So I hope you all have a very good week while you come from the library clutching your book of Dylan Thomas's poems. And I hope you'll be here to join me next week. It'll be a shorter program, but with more and different poems. Goodbye now. I'll see you then.